The law of non-contradiction, LNC, is a foundational principle of classical logic stating that a proposition and its negation cannot both be true at the same time and in the same sense. Whether contradictions exist, however, depends on whether one is speaking about formal logical rules, empirical reality, or philosophical paradoxes. Different traditions treat contradictions very differently, and this shapes how we interpret systems ranging from logic to theology to artificial intelligence. From the classical perspective, contradictions are strictly impossible. Aristotle considered the LNC the most certain of all principles, and within this framework a contradiction, P and P, is false by definition. Thinkers like Ayn Rand echo this view, arguing that contradictions never exist in reality. If one appears, it signals an error in one's premises or reasoning. Classical logic also ties the rejection of contradictions to linguistic coherence. If they could also mean not a, meaningful communication would collapse, since words would lose their stable reference points. A very different stance is taken by dialetheism, a minority philosophical position championed by figures such as Graham Priest. Dialetheists argue that some contradictions, called dialetheia, are genuinely true. They point to cases like the liar paradox. This statement is false, which appears to be both true and false simultaneously. They also cite real-world inconsistencies, such as a person being legally married in one jurisdiction but not in another, making them both married and not married depending on the legal context. Even transitional states, like being halfway through a doorway, are sometimes interpreted as cases where one is both in the room and not in the room at the same time. To handle such cases without collapsing into triviality, logicians developed alternative systems, such as paraconsistent logic. In classical logic, a single contradiction triggers explosion, meaning that from P and P1 can derive any conclusion whatsoever. Paraconsistent logics avoid this by containing contradictions locally, preventing them from infecting the entire system. They function as a kind of damage control mechanism for inconsistent or incomplete data, allowing reasoning to continue even when contradictions appear. The term omniconsistent logic is not a classical logical concept like omega consistency, but instead appears in modern AI and computer science. Whereas omega consistency concerns infinite sets of statements about natural numbers, omniconsistency refers to systems that maintain coherence across all modes, interfaces, or data streams. In AI, this means ensuring that a model's outputs remain consistent across different styles or contexts. In enterprise data systems, omniconsistency refers to synchronized truth across all databases so that no contradictory versions of the same metric arise. In large language models, logical consistency is used as a proxy for reliability. An omniconsistent model would not contradict itself when asked the same question in different ways. This notion of omniconsistency also parallels a classic hermeneutical approach in theology. The assumption that a sacred text is perfectly unified and non-contradictory leads to a method often called the analogy of faith, analogia fidei. Here an apparent contradiction is not treated as a failure of the text, but as a signal that the interpreter's understanding is incomplete. A contradiction becomes a re-entry point that forces the reader to refine context, adjust definitions, or discover a deeper symbolic meaning that harmonizes the passages. This creates what might be called an omniconsistent loop. One begins with the presupposition that the text cannot contradict itself. When two passages appear to conflict, the interpreter concludes that the misunderstanding lies in their own interpretation, not in the text. They then derive a new meaning that reconciles the passages, thereby reinforcing the system's internal unity. This mirrors the way omega consistency ensures that general rules do not conflict with specific instances. A general doctrine, e.g., God is love, becomes the interpretive lens through which difficult or ambiguous passages must be read. However, this method carries a risk often described as the Procrustean bed problem. In the effort to preserve perfect consistency, one may stretch or compress the meaning of passages so drastically that the original intent is lost. The system remains consistent, but only because the interpreter has reshaped the data to fit the framework, rather than allowing the framework to be challenged by the data. How an individual might try to express a P and not P structure using the Trinity, and why classical theology immediately blocks that move while some modern or confused interpretations accidentally fall into it. Let's break it into the three major logical frameworks we've been working with. 1. Classical, LNC. 2. Dialetheism, true contradictions. 3. Omniconsistent hermeneutics, where the Trinity sits relative to each. 1. Classical logic. Why the Trinity is not a PP. Classical Christian theology is obsessed with avoiding contradiction. The Nicene and Athanasian creeds were written precisely to prevent a P and not P formulation. The classical formula is 1 essence, ousia, 3 persons, hypostases. This is a category split. It prevents the contradiction. God is one and God is not one. Instead, it becomes God is one in essence, P. God is not one in personhood, P. But these are different predicates, so classical logic says no contradiction exists because essence equals person. This is the same move mentioned earlier. Update the definitions to avoid contradiction. It's the hermeneutical version of check your premises. 2. Dialetheist logic. Could someone intentionally frame the Trinity as a true contradiction? Yes, but only if they reject classical categories. A person might try to express the Trinity as God is 1, P, God is 3, P, and insist these refer to the same sense. This would be a dialetheist Trinity, a true contradiction model. Some modern theologians flirt with this, e.g., J.C. Bial's contradictory Christology, arguing that divine mysteries may be dialetheous. They treat the Trinity as a logical paradox similar to the liar paradox. But this is not the classical Christian position. It is a minority philosophical experiment. Still, if someone wants to express the Trinity as PP, they must collapse essence and person into one category. Assert that God is numerically 1 and numerically 3 in the same respect. Accept paraconsistent logic to avoid explosion. This is the diletheist trinity, a deliberate contradiction held as true. 3. Omniconsistent hermeneutics. How a believer avoids contradiction while feeling like they're dealing with one. This is where the framework becomes powerful. A believer might experience the Trinity as a contradiction, 1 God, 3 persons, but because they assume omniconsistency, they treat the contradiction as a signal that their understanding is incomplete, not that the doctrine is contradictory. This mirrors earlier structure. 1. Presupposition. God is perfect and cannot contradict himself. 2. Conflict. 1 and 3 appear contradictory. 3. Resolution. The contradiction must be in my interpretation. 4. Result. I refine categories, essence versus person, until harmony appears. This is exactly the analogy of faith hermeneutic loop. The contradiction becomes a re-entry point, not a logical failure. So how might an individual try to express PP with the Trinity? They would need to do one of the following. Option A. Collapse categories, the mistake root. Treat essence and person as the same predicate. God is 1 being. God is 3 beings. This is a literal contradiction. Classical theology calls this heresy, tritheism or modalism depending on direction. Option B. Embrace diletheism, the philosophical root. Say, God is 1 and not 1 in the same respect. This is a true contradiction, and divine reality transcends classical logic. This requires paraconsistent logic to avoid explosion. Option C. Use omniconsistency, the theological root. Say, it looks like a contradiction, but because God is perfect, the contradiction is in my categories, not in God. This is the classical Christian solution. The key insight. The Trinity only becomes a PP if someone refuses to distinguish the categories. Classical theology. No contradiction, different predicates. Diletheism. True contradiction, same predicate. Omniconsistent hermeneutics. Apparent contradiction, deeper interpretation. If theism is true, then whatever logic God gave us must be the kind of logic that makes God believable by a perfectly rational creature. This idea has consequences for how contradictions, mysteries, and doctrines like the Trinity are handled. 1. The theistic principle pointing toward. On classical theism, God is perfectly rational, perfectly truthful, the creator of human cognitive faculties. So the logic we possess, whatever its limits, is not arbitrary. It is part of the design that makes creatures capable of recognizing truth, avoiding error, perceiving God's existence, forming justified beliefs. This yields a principle. God gives creatures the kind of logic that allows them to believe in him without violating perfect rationality. This is sometimes called the noetic fit principle. The mind God gives us must fit the reality God created. 2. What this means for contradictions. If God is perfectly rational, then God cannot reveal himself in a way that requires actual contradictions. God cannot require belief in PP in the same sense. God cannot demand that rational creatures abandon the very logic he gave them. So on classical theism, any doctrine that looks contradictory must not actually be contradictory. The contradiction is in our categories, not in God. This is exactly why classical theologians fight so hard to distinguish essence versus person, nature versus will, being versus mode of subsistence. They are trying to ensure that divine revelation is logically possible for a rational creature. 3. How this applies to the Trinity. If God gave us logic to believe in him, then the Trinity must be expressible in a way that does not violate the logic he gave us. Thus the classical formulation. 1 essence, what God is. 3 persons, who God is. This avoids the contradiction. God is 1 being, God is 3 beings, and instead becomes, God is 1 in essence, God is 3 in personhood. Different predicates, no contradiction. This is the theological version of the earlier point. God gives us logic that makes him believable, not logically impossible. 4. What if someone wants the Trinity to be a contradiction? Then they must adopt one of 2 non-classical positions. A. Diletheism. True contradictions exist. They would say, God is 1 and not 1 in the same respect. This is a true contradiction, and divine reality transcends classical logic. This requires paraconsistent logic to avoid explosion. B. Mystical anti-rationalism. They would say, God transcends logic, so contradictions don't matter. But this violates the principle we've just articulated. If God gave us logic to know him, he cannot require us to abandon it to believe in him. So classical theism rejects both. If God is perfect, then the logic he gives us must be the kind of logic that makes belief in him rationally possible. Therefore, doctrines like the Trinity cannot be genuine contradictions. This is constraint ties, epistemology, theology, logic, divine nature, into one unified principle. On theism, God gives us logic. God gives us revelation. God gives us rational faculties. Therefore, God cannot reveal himself in a way that violates the very logic he designed us to use. So the Trinity must be mysterious, complex, beyond full comprehension. But not a literal PP. If it did, the error is not in God, but in your way or thinking.